In modern America, it is taken for granted that schools teach not only information and mental skills, but also values. And that is one reason why schools are required to be racially integrated nowadays and to provide indoctrination against the use of drugs. It also explains why parents are sometimes alarmed at what is taught in schools. So, at times, evolution has been an alarming subject. Sex education, um, having students read such books as Huckleberry Finn, and so on. The idea that schools teach values and that those values help shape society is an old one. It emerged clearly during the educational reform movements of the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, movements that gave rise to the modern public school system as we know it today. In the colonial era and even in the early years of the United States, the education of American children was informal, it was unsystematic, it was dependent upon parental initiative. Do I want my kid to be educated or not? And also ability to pay. So wealthy Americans were able to send their children to private schools and then eventually universities, or were able to engage tutors, teachers who taught their children and their children alone. But the rapid changes in American society lent urgency to the notion that if America was to remain a prosperous and virtuous people, education must guide youths along the right paths. And the central figure in this movement for public education, for education reform, was Horace Mann. You see him on the left. He was the chief officer of the Massachusetts Board of Education from 1837 to 1848. And this Massachusetts public school system that Mann created became a model for other states and the pattern for the American public school system as a home, or as a whole, sorry. Mann proclaimed that the common school was, quote, the greatest discovery ever made by man. So, man, Mann, said that it was the greatest discovery made by man, Man, in the sense of humanity. Other social organizations, he said, are curative and remedial. This, public schools, is a preventive and an antidote. Horace Mann, thought that the school representing the highest instincts of society could alone be counted upon to cultivate decency, cooperation, and respect for others. He preferred women as teachers because they seemed to be more nurturing. It didn't hurt that women could be hired more cheaply either. And by the 1850s, the main elements of public education, public schools, as man envisioned them, were in place. And by this, I mean to say normal schools, quote unquote, normal, um, nowadays what we call teaching colleges. So these were normal schools for teaching students, or sorry, teaching educators, for teaching teachers, how to educate children in this new public school environment. There was also a system of grading pupils according to age and ability, standardized procedures for advancement. How much did you need to know in order to advance to the next grade? Uniform textbooks and a uniform curriculum, and a system of superintendents, who would preside over a school district, and then principals, someone in charge of each school, and then of course, teachers um, within each school. The Northeast led the way in public education, followed by the American Midwest and the Mid Atlantic states. The South, especially the Deep South, undervalued public education and, for the most part, did not create a large scale public school system until after the American Civil War. The characteristics that were most esteemed by educational reformers. So this public education is yet another reform movement. These values were precisely those that were alleged to bring material success in a competitive and market oriented society. So, punctuality, obedience, honesty, responsibility, perseverance. And the underlying value system tended to be, consciously or not, that of Protestant Christianity. And Catholics, recognizing this, began to establish their own schools, parochial schools. We still see those today. Free blacks were largely excluded from the benefits of free education, although by 1855, Massachusetts passed a law barring exclusion on the grounds of race, color, or religious opinions. Women were permitted only limited access to higher education, so education beyond um, uh, the what we now think of as K through 12 education. What was not, you didn't have high schools back then, but you get the idea. Let me show you a photograph here. There we are. In a second. Okay. So you have these main elements of the American public school system. This is a slide that apparently did not make it into my um, printout. So again, normal schools for training teachers. Okay, I've said this already. The grading of school pupils according to age and ability, standardized procedures for advancement, uniform curriculum, as opposed to student-centered learning. And what I mean by that is there is a way, and you see it today. You saw it in the public schools that you probably went to, the K through 12 education that you had, and you see it at Ohio State. There is a curriculum, that you are of courses and subjects that you're required to learn about and required to know. And you learn about them when the curriculum says that you learn about them, you know, not necessarily when you're ready, or interested in learning the subject, but when the system says you are going to learn this subject now. And this extends even today in both public schools and at college. You're probably taking this course. It's because the general education curriculum at the Ohio State University requires you to take a history course. You're probably taking it because it fits into your schedule right now. You're probably not taking it because you're at a point in your life where American history, suddenly interests you and you want to learn about American history, or you want to learn specifically about the life of Frederick Douglass, this kind of thing. This is all being imposed on you. There is another way of looking at education, and you're beginning to see it emerge, but it still has a ways to go, and it's oriented toward focused on on, hey, a student has gotten interested in this particular subject, this interest. Let's reinforce that interest. Let's teach them about that subject now at a time when they are interested in learning about it. This idea would have been mind blowing in the 19th century because it was really antithetical to the values of a society in which your employer imposed on you, hey, this is the time you're going to go to work, this is when you get to take a break, this is how hard you're going to work, these are the penalties for for not working hard enough, and so on. So everything is imposed on the laborer in the same way that the curriculum imposes on the child. And then of course you have this hierarchical system of school superintendents, principals, and teachers. And then the characteristics. Again, awareness of time. The clock becomes important. Being able to read a clock becomes important. Punctuality is important. Obedience is important. Honesty, responsibility, perseverance. These things are all important. And I want you to look at this photograph of a 19th century American classroom. Note the uniformity. All the students are in rows. And in rural areas, a one-room schoolhouse was common. This might very well be a one-room schoolhouse here, although I don't think so. Um, but in a one-room schoolhouse, you would have the older children seated in the back, the younger children seated in the front, and one teacher supervised both groups. There was no kindergarten during this period. The idea of preschool and kindergarten emerged in the United States only in the 1960s, and education in the 19th century and on into the early 20th century often ended with the eighth grade. So the modern concept of high school had yet to appear. Memorization and recitation were common methods of learning, and again, the curriculum was rigid. And to repeat a point, that remains the case, down to today. So by memorization, it would mean that they drill down very hard on here's what's in the textbook. You're supposed to memorize what's in the textbook. Sometimes to reinforce this, a student would be brought up in front of the class and would recite the lecture, what they had learned for the entire class. That is the public school system as it emerged during this reform movement. It's an important innovation in the sense that we're now talking about free education for American children, but we're also talking about a reform movement in which this free education was attuned to the values and the needs of a market revolution society.